Hello, listeners, from Roy Demarev in Sam, back from Moscow, and I've got about three things on my mind as I make this recording. The first is just to mention a little bit about Moscow and its centre. Then I would like to just touch upon the tax reforms which are now being proposed by Trump and the Republican Party, and finally spend a bit more time on something I've just read by Michael Porter of Harvard Business School, who has written a paper called Why Politics is Failing America and What Business Can Do to Help. That's quite striking, although I think his solutions are not so obvious as he thinks they are. But let me just speak briefly about Moscow, because I was there last Sunday, and indeed Monday. But on Sunday I went to the English church, which is called St Andrew's. I was down to preach only, but the person who should have taken the service, which was just morning prayer, could not make it in time because of the marathon. It's not just Geneva that gets blocked out by marathons, and we saw the marathons running by. They were very serious, of course, and lots of participants. All the roads were closed, but I went by metro. So I ended up both taking the service and giving a sermon. They have in St Andrews a brand new chaplain, and the reason I was doing that job is that he was away at Synod of the Northern European Archdiaconal Synod, and they held that in Crete. And I'd met him anyway. I met him on the Tuesday, and his wife Alison. His name is Malcolm Rogers, and he's pretty fresh from Britain, from Bury St Edmunds, and obviously much more open to the assistance of lay readers in particular than his predecessors. So that will be an interesting relationship that develops each time I go to or through Moscow. Now, Moscow itself is looking particularly beautiful, and I would like to mention two things. Just outside the metro station called Plochad Revolucji, which is right near the Kremlin and opposite, but a long way back from the Bolshoi Theatre, they've built a series of stands or floats decorated with autumn leaves of brilliant colours and such things as pumpkins. And within these stands there are many people selling things, ranging from cheeses to simply coffee or something to eat on the spot. And the point I want to make is that it was very crowded, people wandering around in there, literally thousands, and looking very happy on what might have been the last really sunny weekend in Moscow at the end of summer. But then beyond that, I visited a new park, another huge park. Those of you who've been to Moscow before might remember a particularly ugly and big hotel called the Rossiya, and it really was a disgrace to the area. They pulled it down completely, and it covered a very big area, and that very big area has now been turned into a park. Again, so many people wandering around looking happy that I didn't stay just because I can't stand that amount of crowdedness. But it was impressive to see that so much had been spent in effort and money, presumably, to build this new park where there was earlier just a monstrosity. Right, now let me turn to the second topic, briefly mention the tax reforms put forward by Trump. They're very difficult to understand. The good thing that I get out of his announcement is that corporate tax rates in the USA will be lowered from being about the highest in the world to somewhere near the average, and that can only be welcomed as a good thing for keeping the economy going. But remember that the large companies, the multinational companies, don't really pay anything like the official tax rate in the USA. There are so many things they can do to reduce their taxation and keep employed many thousands of tax advisors. But it would be good if it were simplified, so I, for once, find myself saying what Trump wants to do seems to be a good thing. Now we'll see if he can actually pull it off. The other side of the tax reforms are the personal taxes on employees or entrepreneurs, and that is far less clear. He says that he is not going to damage or increase the taxation on the lower paid and the middle classes. But his Democratic opponents say, well, his whole idea is to reduce the taxes on the very rich and increase, in fact, the de facto taxes on the middle classes and the poor. It's unclear yet, so we'll have to have quite a look at that as things develop. But in a way, I wish the Americans luck in trying to reform their tax structure, which currently is pretty awful. That brings me to my third subject in this broadcast, which is the paper and the work which is going to be done by Michael Porter in Harvard Business School. I, in a sense, work with him because in Robert Kennedy College, we have a program which I helped bring in. It's about competitiveness and the creation of clusters which so helps the economy of any area and indeed country to work better. Now, one of his great contributions is that he looks at the way companies position themselves in 4 dimensions as businesses, and he looks at the competition and the demand and, of course, the risk of new entries as competitors, which is particularly relevant to what he's now going to do on the political situation in America, which he finds extremely unsatisfactory because he reckons that it is working for the benefit of the few, the big businesses for a start, rather than for the people as a whole. Now, that is a concept which I brought out in my own doctoral thesis about Russia, the Soviet Union in particular, before it all fell, although it hasn't changed much, where it's perfectly obvious that the Soviet Union couldn't reform just because it benefited the ruling classes against the people as a whole. That's a very common phenomenon, and it's a phenomenon which is alive and kicking in Russia today, in America today, and even in Britain today, because I've just seen the broadcast made by the Labour Party at their conference, and although I don't agree with their economics one little bit, they're certainly bringing out this idea that the current setup is too much in favour of the privileged few and not working to the advantage of the people as a whole. Let me just read a paragraph from the paper I've got by Michael Porter, in which he's working with a lady called Gail, and it says, to understand how and why politics has in the USA become so disconnected from serving the people and producing positive results, Porter and Gale have studied the business of politics as if they were studying any company or sector, looking at the structural components such as competitors, customers, channels to reach customers, suppliers, and the threat of new entrants into the market. And the use for that is 5 forces framework. They wanted to know how a country that personified, I would rather say epitomized, the success of modern democracy after World War II, how could it have fallen into a state of failure and inertia with no end in sight? See, he's very critical of his own country. How do you have this system that's not meeting the customer's needs, the citizens' needs, not solving the problems that are in the public interest, and yet we are not holding them accountable? Interesting, isn't it? It's a sort of language that Trump used when on the election campaign. But in the end, of course, it was really a lie from Trump, because he's very much in favour of the interests of the big business. And he talks about clearing the swamp in Washington, but he's doing nothing to do that at all. It's not at all obvious that Porter and Gale's suggestions will do much more than that anyway. But let me just go a little further and say they've got these 4 ideas, which I would summarise as follows. They think that they do need to change the election process so that there is a non-partisan redistribution panel for the different voting areas, and that would open access to presidential debates to candidates outside the 2 major parties. And that is one of the points he's making. They kind of get together, the Republicans and Democrats, so there's no hope for a third party or an individual to break that barrier. Having said that, of course, Trump did, but in his very strange way of actually taking over, at least temporarily, the Republican Party. He wants to restructure the governing process by forming an independent commission to redesign the congressional rules, again, to reduce the control of the two parties. I don't think he'll pull that off either, but I've got to tell you what he said and form your own judgment. Now, his third point is about lobbying. He wants to reduce, or they want to reduce, the influence that money buys in politics. Now, they don't suggest eliminating fundraising completely, but they want to ensure proper transparency, that we know who and why make the donations. Echoes there, of course, of the Russian, not exactly donations, but using Facebook to give messages rather in favour of Trump versus Hillary, which is an ongoing issue, of course. And his fourth point is that he would like there to be a small group of independent centrist US senators who could form a swing coalition to align with either party on a given issue. In a way, that's happening, but it's just because there's a very, very narrow majority of the Republicans in the Senate, and some of these Republicans are quite rebellious against Trump. Don't blame them. Well, I don't know to what extent my alma mater, Harvard Business School, can influence or play politics. Certainly they are usually very much in favour of the free market economy and capitalism, and I don't disagree with them on any of that. On the contrary, I'm a product of that. But I do think there is room for greater transparency and better balance in taxation and the way decisions are made. So what Porter and Gale are going to do is organise a big meeting, convene a major event at Harvard Business School for top business leaders to tackle the issues. And they will bring in the HBS current students to help organise that, and presumably Harvard alumni. Across the country in the USA, it says, it doesn't actually call upon graduates who happen to live in Europe or somewhere else. Let me quote Porter and Gale just a bit more about business. They're saying today's CEOs need to redefine corporate purpose in ways that align strategy and business competition, align these things with the needs of society, and that will require a different relationship with government. If the political system is to work for everyone, ordinary citizens also must take responsibility for action and demand changes in the rules of the game. Well, there we are. I wish them lots of luck without being too optimistic. Whenever someone comes along with, as it were, messianic visions of reform, they tend to lose their ardour after a few weeks or reality hits them. But I guess Porter, being such a respected and successful academic businessman, you might say, could have some influence. He would have a following of business leaders throughout the world, actually, so they will listen to him. I'm sure they will come to his meetings, and they might come up with some great ideas to indeed attack the problem he identifies. But we all identify that somehow the USA is a great country which isn't quite working the way it should. Now, how this affects our investments, we'll have to look into on another broadcast. So I will speak to you again next week.